So aside from Skinner, there was another very influential theorist in this perspective, which was Albert Bandura, and he really talked a lot about observed learning, right? Things that people could just observe and not necessarily have to experience directly, but they could still learn from it in a very influential way. And one of the experiments that he did was the one involving the Bobo doll, right? So the Bobo doll was an old style toy, and it was weighted on the bottom, and then it was an inflatable cone, if you will, with usually with a picture drawn on it of a clown or something like that. And when you pushed Bobo or hit Bobo, he would rock over, and then he would pop back up because of the weighted bottom. So Bandura designed an experiment to show that the person didn't have to learn from being reinforced or punished directly, that they could observe somebody else doing something, experiencing the consequences of behavior, and they could learn from that, right? So he set up a Bobo doll experiment, and he made three different videotapes of adults interacting with Bobo. In one tape, the adult interacting with Bobo was very nice and gentle and just pushed Bobo over in a very, very gentle manner. In the second tape, the adult interacting with Bobo, was a lot more forceful and would push Bobo pretty hard and knock him down and bring him up and knock him down and bring him up. And in the third tape, they purposely made it so that the adult in the video was going over the top to smack Bobo over the head with a wooden hammer and really beat the crap out of Bobo, throw him around the room, right? And so now Bandura took a group of children and put them in each of the video components, right? And so he then recorded the response of the child after they had viewed the videotape and were put in a similar circumstance. And it turned out they were given no other instruction, just the video that they had watched. And of course, the majority of the time, between 75 and 80% of the time, the child had viewed the adult interacting with Bobo, interacted with Bobo in the exact same way. And when they were questioned, they said, well, I observed somebody interacting with Bobo, an adult, and I thought that was the appropriate thing to do. So from this, Bandura concluded that observational learning could be extremely influential, right? So when we see someone model a behavior or exhibit a particular behavior, it's very possible that the person is learning in a very influential way, right? So Bandura talked to us about social learning and cognitive learning being influenced, not just the idea of the behavior being directly reinforced, right? So I think this is an important perspective, and I think that a lot of looking at this behavioral approach to behavior does drive some of the interventions that we have, that we use in terms of therapies, right? So cognitive behavioral interventions come directly from this approach. And that basically is based upon the fact, we'll talk about it a little later, but it's based upon the fact that you have to change the assumptions and the thought processes that are leading you to react in a certain way. Because many times our behavior is based upon assumptions that are not totally correct. So if we can change those assumptions, then our behavior changes, right? And that comes directly from this perspective also. Okay, I want to move on now to the next perspective that we're going to talk about, which is the humanistic perspective. The humanistic perspective was a real change when it came about, right? This came about toward the 50s, the late 50s and the 60s, and really was a more modern approach, was probably around until Carl Rogers was around until the 1980s, right? And Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, two of the real proponents of this theory, the humanistic approach, they have learning institutes still all around the country that espouse the humanistic perspective. The big change in this was that the humanistic perspective was a far more positive approach to personality, right? Personality theory. Why was it so much more positive? Well, if you think about the Freudian approach, right, that was very it was really kind of a dark approach to personality theory, because it assumed that we are driven by our instincts for sex and death, and that overriding instinct drives most of our behavior, right? So that wasn't really a very positive view. It was a very animalistic view of human nature, right? And then you have the behavioral approach, which kind of assumed that we did play a role when you talk about the updated social cognitive theory approach. But behavioral approaches traditionally were more interested in how the environment was impacting us in order to influence our behavior, not really concerned about how our perspective was particularly involved in developing our personality and our behavior. And the trait theorists, yes, they took into account some of our traits, but it was looked at as sort of very mechanical and just piecing it together a picture, rather than talking about the actual development of people and their personalities. So it was thought of as being sort of mechanical in a way, right? So the humanistic perspective came around, and it was developed basically by a number of different people, but the most influential theorists in this school were certainly Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. As I said, into the 50s, 1950s and 1960s, and then all the way through the 80s. And Maslow did something that was really interesting, right? When he was developing the humanistic perspective, right? Both of these guys had very, very important contributions. But the difference with Maslow was he looked at all the personality theories that we had, and he thought they were very negative in their viewpoints, right, of human nature. He thought they did not give the human as a more advanced species and a more developed brain the will and ability to actually impact their own behavior, right? So he was very much trying to give a more positive spin on personality theory, right? And basically the way he approached his studies was very simple. He said, look, instead of studying people's weaknesses and why they're sick and why they can't accomplish things, I'm going to come from a perspective where I am actually studying people's strengths and the reasons that they are successful. Well, this was a really radical way of looking at researching human personality, right, at the time. And so Maslow really started to look in an archival manner and that means like looking back into the literature and talking about the personality characteristics that great self-actualizers had. Now, he used this term self-actualization, which meant that it was somebody who was trying to make full use of their potential, full growth of their self worth and their self growth continued throughout their lifetime. So he said that we have a basic need to self-actualize, right, to build our repertoire, to continue to grow. But sometimes things get in the way of that, right? And if something gets in the way, we don't grow as much as we could. And so he came from a perspective that we all have the ability to push through our problems, to really have control over our lives and the directions that it takes. Did not like the idea of being impacted solely by the environment and not having control, right? So he viewed self-actualization as an ongoing process, something that we continue to evolve throughout our lifetime, right? And so instead of studying a group of people that were ill, like Freud, all of Freud's theories came from case studies with people that he classified as having mental disabilities, right? Well, this was exactly the opposite. Maslow looked at the list of characteristics and he said, I'm going to look at what are these people who I call great self-actualizers, people like Einstein and Walt Whitman and creative people, right? What is it that they have in common that drives them to self-actualize or to continue to try to grow throughout their lifetime, right? And so he outlined 10 similarities which great self-actualizers tend to have. So I'm going to go through those very quickly, just so that you get an idea of how it's important for us to acknowledge some of the really positive things also, right? So one of the things that great self-actualizers had in common was good perceptions of reality. That is, they were able to detect dishonesty in other people, right? They were very realistic about what their chances about things were. And so they were well grounded because of their good perceptions of reality. not allowing themselves to fall into the hands of dishonest influences. Second characteristic they had in common was an acceptance of self and others' human nature, right? So they didn't um, make themselves crazy about mistakes they made. They accepted their own mistakes, and they didn't look at other people and say, "I'm going to not respect this person because they made some mistakes." Right? They were very allowing of human nature and the foibles that we have. The third characteristic they had in common was spontaneity. Now, spontaneity basically means that you don't have to be planned about everything you do. When something arises, you are able to go with the flow. And I think that goes to coping skills, right? So that if something comes up and life gives you lemons, you're able to make lemonade. I think that's what that refers to quite a bit. The fourth characteristic they had in common was task centering. Task centering was having a mission in life, right? So something that drove the person and would enable them to perform at their best capabilities and continue to grow. Number five, the fifth characteristic was autonomy. That is, they weren't dependent on other people to say, why don't you go ahead and do this? They were autonomous. They were able to function on their own, have their own motivation, right? The sixth thing they had in common was constantly renewing their appreciation of life's basic things, right? So they stopped and they smelled the roses, right? They were able to appreciate a sunrise and having a close friend and things that are basic to our existence, not to get past that, right? Always appreciating the little things. Number seven, they were able to identify with other human beings. That is, they didn't consider themselves better in any way. They may have either more money or more power or more influence, but they were not better. They were still willing to listen to other people around them. Right? That was number seven. Number eight, they tended to have deep interpersonal relationships. So Maslow said that basically when he looked at these people, they may have had broad circles of acquaintances, but the friendship circles were tended to be pretty close and pretty deep, right? So that's very important. Number nine, they had a non-hostile sense of humor. A non-hostile sense of humor. What does that mean? Basically, they were able to laugh at themselves. They were able to laugh at others, but not hostile in the sense of making fun of other people and giving other people, putting them down in order to laugh. And number 10, they were able to appreciate peak experiences. Peak experiences. And what does that mean? They were able to still have deep meaning in their lives. They had depth of experience. They had depth of appreciation. They still had great depth of in their relationships. So allowing themselves to have peak experiences where they really embrace the idea of a great sunrise or jumping out of an airplane or whatever it might be. If you remember, George H.W. Bush jumped out of an airplane to celebrate both his 80th and 90th birthdays, which is pretty cool. Um, okay, so that was the list of 10 things that they had in common. And remember, this is very, very important because Maslow went with the assumption that people were trying to self-actualize, right? That as long as they prioritized their life, they were able to have some influence in the direction that their lives were going. Now I want to move on to another very influential person in this area. His name is Carl Rogers, right? And like I said, Rogers was around into the 1980s, so he's relatively more recent as a therapist and as a theorist, right? And Rogers' model of personality focused on the importance of the self, right? The importance of the self. Like, what is my perspective, and that is in fact my reality, right? So Rogers looked at a lot of clinical studies, and he believed that the self emerges from a person's totally subjective view of reality. So what's reality to the subject or the patient is in fact their reality. And so Rogers believed that the only answers to problems that his patients had lay with inside the patient, that he couldn't tell them how to fix themselves, but he could guide them on a self-awareness journey so that they could fix themselves, right? And he thought that basically our troubles came from comparing our ideal self that we have, like what we should be doing or what we should be accomplishing, to what we actually are accomplishing and what we actually have accomplished. And so people usually have this image that they're supposed to be living up to. And because of that, they experienced anxiety when they didn't quite live up to that image, right? So he believed in this concept of unconditional positive regard. That is valuing another person as having intrinsic worth, regardless of that person's behavior at that moment, at that time, right? And so, in his therapy, emotive therapy, he wanted to give that unconditional positive regard. He called his mode of therapy client centered or person centered therapy. And he called it that because basically he believed that it was the person that was the patient that was speaking that was going to be the center of the therapy, right? They were going to guide where the therapy was going to go. And Rogers was going to be their guide along the way. He was the guy that was going to make sure that they didn't go off track in their journey, right? So if you remember, a lot of Hollywood portrays psychotherapy as being sort of directed by the therapist, right? So that would be more the Freudian classic therapy, right, where the therapist is interpreting dreams or interpreting statements that are made. So that's more of a common sort of Freudian psychotherapy, psychodynamic approach. In humanistic therapies, right, if you look on the YouTube video of Carl Rogers actually performing therapy, what you'll find is he does not interpret or answer. He restates things. He's actively listening, but he's guiding people by accepting them, by giving them their unconditional positive regard. He's guiding people to the answers, but not giving them the answers. And many times on the tapes, you'll see that the patient actually will say, please interpret this for me, give me an answer, tell me what to do. And Rogers refuses to do this because he believes if he gives the client the answer, that it's an artificial adjustment of the behavior, that they have to realize things inside themselves and then make the behavioral adjustments along with that, right? So Carl Rogers, this client-centered therapy is a very, very important concept that he passed on, and this is something that people still practice as a form of therapy, this client-centered therapy. And some people find it very rewarding, and some people find it frustrating because the therapist is not giving you the answers, just trying to lead you to those answers. Again, I encourage you to take a look at YouTube and look at a Carl Rogers session, client session, and that will give you a good insight into client-centered therapy. So Rogers actually practiced therapy into the 80s, as I said, and he encouraged other therapists to give this unconditional positive regard and to make it so that the patient in the session feels like they are being listened to actively and that they are regarded, regardless of what they've done, they are regarded as a human being with something to contribute, right? So that's really the underlying key to the humanistic perspective. They wanted to really underline the fact that we have control over our own behaviors and the outcomes of how our personality develops. So it was, as I said, it was a much more positive view of personality theory. One last humanistic theorist that I want to tell you about that you will not find in your book is someone that I studied under named Sidney Girard at the University of Florida. And Dr. Girard had a very interesting mode of study where he talked about relationships. And he talked about disclosure in relationships. And this was a very important topic in terms of the humanistic perspective on how we interact with each other. And he talked about the idea, two very important concepts that I think are worth mentioning. One was the idea of self-disclosure, right? So he didn't want, in relationships, he tried to emphasize keeping the balance within a relationship in terms of how much was self-disclosed. He said that basically if you have one person that's giving their deepest, darkest secrets and another person that's still sort of introducing themselves and being very casual, you're going to have an imbalance in that relationship that's going to tip the relationship into a non-tenable type of existence, right? So Sid Gerard had that piece when he talked about relationships and self-disclosure. And he also talked about something that I think is very important in relationships, which is the concept of regression to the means, right? Basically, what Gerard said is in a relationship, most of the time, as relationships progress, you see that people in the relationship tend to move toward each other rather than away from each other. And that's a healthy thing. Like if their tendencies tend to move toward each other, like if one person tends to eat one thing and another person started out not being, but then they move toward eating the same thing, or they move toward similar thought processes, those are very important pieces of growth in a relationship. So regression toward the means within a relationship, you tend to regress toward your partner, and that's a healthy thing. If you continue to move in diametrically opposed directions, probably not a healthy thing for the relationship, right? So that is some of the things that I learned from Dr. Gerard. So one of the other things I wanted to point out, remember I told you a little bit in Trait Theorists about personality tests, right? And I just wanted to give you the idea that we do use these type of tests quite frequently, and they come from different perspectives. So the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, that comes more from the trait theorist perspectives, as I told you, right? But some of the other tests that we use will come also from the psychodynamic perspective, like projective tests talk about. They come from a more psychodynamic perspective because they're looking into the person, into their thought process, and they're trying to project what the personality is, even though they can't see it, right? So that would be an interpretation that they give. And I told you about the Rorschach test, or the ink blots, and how the psychologists interpret that. I told you about the TAT, or the thematic apperception test, which is a neutral image that you then go about and explain the perspective from your point of view, right? And so a lot of times, these personality tests are used in conjunction with other types of tests, like the MMPI. The projective tests and the objective tests are used together to formulate a picture of someone's personality. And the psychologist performing the tests will then write a report that talks about the person's personality, and whether or not the personality fits into certain profiles, so that you can get a perspective on how the person is functioning. So that's what I wanted to tell you about this week. I hope everybody had a good week off, and we are going to have two more tapes that you'll be able to view. And that'll be it for the semester. So if anybody has any questions, please make sure that you email me, and I'll see you down the road.